There is a story older than any civilization we have ever known, older than the pyramids, older than the first city ever built along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. A story that does not begin with the rise of an empire, but with the first breath of a single man standing in a garden in a world that had just been spoken into existence. And it ends, not with silence, but with a battle, the final battle, at the place the ancient Hebrew prophets called Armageddon, the mountain of gathering, the hill above the valley where history will draw its last breath before a new age begins. Between that garden and that valley lies the full arc of the biblical timeline. 6,000 years of recorded pattern, 6,000 years of covenant, fracture, exile, return, and ultimate consummation. And what makes this timeline unlike any other historical record is not merely its antiquity. It is the internal architecture, the way each era mirrors another, the way the same themes repeat across centuries, across languages, across empires that rose to glory and crumbled into the dust of the very ground where Adam was first formed. This is not just history. This is a blueprint. In the beginning, there was nothing. Not darkness as we understand it. Not emptiness as we experience it in a quiet room or a still night. There was an absence so complete, so total, that the human mind cannot fully comprehend it. No matter, no time, no space, no dimension in which anything could exist. And then, a word was spoken, and everything that is became. The biblical account of creation does not open with the story of humanity. It opens with the story of order emerging from void, light separated from darkness, waters divided from waters, land rising from the deep, life unfolding in sequence, in structure, in deliberate progression over 6 days of creative work. And on the 6th day, man was formed, not evolved, not assembled, formed from the dust of the ground according to the ancient text, and breathed into with the breath of life itself, a being unlike anything else in creation, made, as the account declares, in the image of the one who made him. His name was Adam, and beside him stood Eve. They were placed in a garden to the east, a garden called Eden, a place of abundance, of harmony, of unbroken communion with the divine. Every tree, every river, every creature, all of it given to them freely, all of it theirs to tend, to name, to inhabit. With one boundary, one tree at the center of the garden, whose fruit was forbidden, not because the Creator was withholding something good, but because every covenant requires a test of loyalty. Every relationship of trust requires the freedom to choose otherwise. And so, the first chapter of the timeline was also the first great test. It did not take long for that test to be failed. A voice came into the garden, not the voice of the Creator, but a voice that questioned what the Creator had said. Subtle, measured, persuasive. The ancient text calls it the serpent, a creature described as more cunning than any other living thing. Did God really say, it asked, 3 words? And with those 3 words, the architecture of trust began to fracture. Eve listened. Adam followed. The fruit was taken, eaten. And in that moment, something changed in the world that had never changed before. Shame entered. Hiding entered. Death entered. Not immediately, not as a sudden strike of lightning, but as a slow, inevitable unraveling. The ground was cursed. Labor became pain. Relationship became conflict. And the man and the woman were driven from the garden, away from the tree of life, into a world now marked by mortality. This was the fall, and every thread of the biblical timeline that follows is the story of what comes after the fall. a long, winding, costly road back toward restoration. The generations that followed Adam were long, extraordinarily long, according to the genealogical records preserved in the ancient text. Adam himself, the account tells us, lived 930 years. His son Seth lived 912. Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, each name followed by a lifespan that stretches across what we today would consider multiple generations. And among these early patriarchs, one name stands apart. Enoch, a man described in only a handful of lines, yet those lines carry enormous weight. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not. For God took him. No burial, no death recorded, simply gone, translated from one existence into another. A figure who many scholars interpret as a foreshadowing of something far greater yet to come. But the world around these long-lived patriarchs was not walking the same path as Enoch. It was descending. The text describes the accumulation of human wickedness during these early centuries with startling clarity. That the thoughts of humanity had become continually, overwhelmingly, relentlessly corrupt. That violence had filled the earth. That the original order of creation had been twisted almost beyond recognition. And so the Creator made a decision, not of abandonment, but of reset. One man stood apart from the corruption of his age. His name was Noah. And like Enoch before him, the text says simply that he walked with God. In a world that had forgotten what that meant, Noah remembered. He was given instructions, detailed, specific, architectural instructions. Build a vessel, a massive floating structure of dimensions so precise that engineers have studied them across the centuries, finding in them a surprisingly stable and seaworthy ratio. Fill it with every kind of living creature. Prepare for a flood unlike anything the world had ever seen. It came. For 40 days and 40 nights, the waters fell from above and rose from below. The fountains of the great deep were broken open. The floodgates of the heavens were released, and the world that had been was submerged. When the waters receded, when the vessel came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, a different world emerged. Quieter, emptier, washed. Noah stepped onto new ground and built an altar, and a covenant was made. A promise sealed with a sign stretched across the sky. A rainbow. The first rainbow in recorded biblical history. A symbol that the waters would never again cover the entire earth in judgment. The timeline continued. From a new beginning, from the sons of Noah, the nations spread. This is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire biblical record. Chapter 10 of the book of Genesis contains what scholars call the Table of Nations, a genealogical map of how the 70 nations of the ancient world descended from 3 sons: Shem, Ham, Japheth. Their descendants spreading east and west, north and south, populating the known world. And among those descendants, a builder arose, a man of ambition and vision, whose name the text does not fully preserve, but whose project became one of the most discussed episodes in the early biblical timeline. A tower, built on the plains of Shinar, built not for shelter, but for ascent, for a reaching toward heaven that was not born of reverence, but of self-exaltation. Let us make a name for ourselves, the people said. The project was halted. The languages were confused. The nations scattered. And from that scattering, a new movement began. Not of many nations, but of one man. One man called out from among all the others. One man chosen not because of his greatness, but because through him a nation would be formed. And through that nation, a blessing would come to all the families of the earth. His name was Abram. The call of Abram marks one of the great turning points in the biblical timeline. Everything before it was prologue. The creation, the fall, the flood, the scattering, all of it setting the stage for this moment, for this covenant, this choosing of a man from the city of Ur, in the land of the Chaldeans, who would leave everything he knew in response to a voice he could not see. "Go," the voice said, "to the land I will show you." No map, no guarantee of safe passage, no outline of what lay ahead. Only a promise: "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abram went. He traveled through Canaan. He descended into Egypt during a famine. He parted ways with his nephew Lot. He defeated kings to rescue Lot's household. He stood before the mysterious priest-king Melchizedek, who brought bread and wine and blessed him in the name of the Most High God. And then, when Abram was old, when Sarah his wife had passed beyond all natural hope of bearing a child, the covenant was sealed. His name was changed from Abram to Abraham, father of a multitude, and the son of promise was given. Isaac was born, and the line of the covenant continued. Isaac, Jacob, and from Jacob, 12 sons. This is the structure that would define the next several centuries of the biblical timeline. 12 sons of one man, 12 tribes of what would become one nation, each son a thread, each thread weaving together into the fabric of Israel. But the path from 12 sons to 12 tribes was not smooth. One of those sons, the 11th, the beloved of his father, was betrayed, sold into slavery by his own brothers, carried down into Egypt in chains. His name was Joseph. And yet, what looked like a catastrophe was a pivot. Joseph rose, through suffering, through imprisonment, through the gift of interpreting dreams. Joseph rose from the pit of slavery to the second highest position in all of Egypt. And when famine struck the ancient world, when his brothers came to Egypt desperate for grain, Joseph was there, waiting, not with vengeance, but with the words that echo across the entire timeline. As one of its most profound statements, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The family of Jacob descended into Egypt, 70 souls, and there they multiplied. Generation after generation in the rich delta of Goshen, until they were not 70, but hundreds of thousands. And then a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. Slavery. For 400 years, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were enslaved in Egypt. Their labor built cities. Their suffering marked centuries. Their children were thrown into the Nile. But the covenant made to Abraham had not been forgotten. Into the reeds of the Nile, a mother placed her infant son in a basket of papyrus and pitch. A princess found him, raised him as her own, educated him in all the wisdom of Egypt. His name was Moses, and Moses would become the central figure of the next great chapter of the biblical timeline, the chapter of Exodus, of departure, of deliverance, of the most dramatic series of confrontations between divine power and human empire ever recorded. 10 plagues descended on Egypt, water turning to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, disease among livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the 10th, the most devastating, the death of the firstborn, a plague from which only those who had placed the blood of a lamb on their doorposts were spared. This was the Passover. A night burned so deeply into the collective memory of the Hebrew people that they would commemorate it every year for thousands of years afterward. A night of deliverance, a night when Pharaoh finally relented and the children of Israel walked out of Egypt. free. Freedom, however, is not the same as arrival. The people of Israel walked out of Egypt into the wilderness, into the Sinai, into 40 years of wandering through a landscape as vast and indifferent as the sky above it. And it was in that wilderness, on the slopes of a mountain that smoked and trembled and blazed with fire, that the next great covenant was established. Moses ascended, and from that mountain came the law. Not merely 10 commandments carved in stone, though those 10 were the foundation, but an entire system of ordinances, of sacrifices, of feast days, of priestly protocol, a comprehensive framework for how this nation would live, how it would worship, how it would relate to the God who had chosen it. The tabernacle was constructed, a portable sanctuary carried through the wilderness, a tent of meeting where the divine presence would dwell in the midst of the camp. And for 40 years, the wilderness generation wandered. Not because the journey required 40 years. It was only a matter of days from Egypt to the border of Canaan. But because of unbelief, because a generation that had witnessed the 10 plagues, the parting of the sea, the provision of manna and water from a rock, still doubted, that generation died in the wilderness. Their children crossed the Jordan River and entered the promised land. The conquest of Canaan under Joshua was swift and sweeping in its first phase. Jericho fell without a single weapon being raised, its walls collapsing at the sound of trumpets and the shout of the people. City after city fell before the advancing tribes of Israel, and the land was divided among the 12 tribes according to their inheritance. But the settlement was never fully completed. Pockets of Canaanite culture remained. Altars to Baal and Asherah dotted the hilltops, and a cycle began that would repeat itself with almost mechanical regularity across the next several centuries. The people abandoned the covenant. They turned to the gods of their neighbors. Oppression followed. Suffering followed. They cried out to their God. A deliverer was raised up, a judge, a warrior leader who broke the cycle of oppression. Peace returned, and then the cycle began again. Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, judge after judge, deliverance after deliverance. And yet the pattern never fully broke, because the problem was not external, it was internal. It was a matter of the heart. And eventually, the people came to the prophet Samuel with a demand. "Give us a king," they said, "like all the other nations." The age of the kings began with Saul, tall, commanding. Everything a nation looking for a king might imagine. And yet Saul failed the tests of obedience. He chose military pragmatism over covenant faithfulness. He spared what he had been commanded to destroy. And the word came, the kingdom would be taken from him. A young shepherd was anointed in secret, David, the son of Jesse of Bethlehem. A man after God's own heart, the text calls him. A warrior who killed giants, a musician who wrote songs that would be sung for 3,000 years, a king who united the 12 tribes under a single crown, who captured Jerusalem, who brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city with such abandon that he danced in the streets, caring nothing for his royal dignity. Under David, Israel reached its greatest geographic extent. Its armies pushed back every neighboring threat. Its borders stretched from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, and to David was given a promise that from his line a king would come, whose kingdom would never end. This was not just a political promise. This was a prophetic declaration that echoed forward through every subsequent generation of the biblical timeline. A promise pointing towards something, someone that the world had not yet seen. Solomon, David's son, built what David had only dreamed of. The temple, 7 years in construction, thousands of laborers, cedars from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, the finest craftsmen of the ancient world, all of it converging on a single hill in Jerusalem, the hill called Moriah, the same hill, many scholars note, where Abraham had once climbed with his son Isaac, knife in hand, trusting that somehow the covenant would hold. The temple was dedicated with fire descending from heaven, with the presence of God filling the house so completely that the priests could not stand to minister. It was the apex of the ancient Israelite world, the moment toward which centuries of preparation had been moving. And yet, Solomon in his old age turned. His many foreign wives brought their gods into the holy city. His heart, the text says, was not wholly devoted as David's heart had been, and the consequences did not fall on Solomon alone. They fell on the nation. After his death, Israel split. 10 tribes to the north, 2 to the south. The unified kingdom of David was gone, and 2 smaller kingdoms, often at war with each other as much as with their enemies, staggered forward through the next several centuries. The northern kingdom, called Israel, lasted just over 200 years after the division. Its kings were, almost without exception, described in the biblical record as those who did evil. Not one of the 19 kings who ruled the northern tribes is commended. Not one walked in the way of the covenant without compromise or outright abandonment. The prophets were sent. Elijah stood on Mount Carmel and called fire from heaven to confront the prophets of Baal. Elisha performed miracle after miracle. Amos thundered against injustice. Hosea wept over spiritual adultery. But the warnings went unheeded. In the year 722 before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire under Shalmaneser V and then Sargon II besieged and destroyed Samaria. The northern kingdom fell. Its population was deported, scattered across the vast territories of Assyria. These became the 10 lost tribes, gone from the stage of history, though echoes of their identity remain a matter of scholarly and theological discussion to this day. The southern kingdom, Judah, survived. For now, Judah had its own prophets, its own cycles of faithfulness and failure. Occasionally, a king would arise who walked in the ways of David. Hezekiah, who prayed as Assyrian armies surrounded Jerusalem and saw 185,000 enemy soldiers dead by morning. Josiah, who found the forgotten book of the law buried in the temple and tore his robes in grief at how far the nation had drifted. But the trajectory was downward. Isaiah warned. Jeremiah wept. Ezekiel saw visions of divine glory departing the temple in stages, like a reluctant farewell. Zephaniah and Habakkuk spoke of a great day of reckoning that was closer than anyone wished to believe. The Babylonian Empire was rising. Under Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful monarchs of the ancient world, the armies of Babylon swept westward. 3 times they came to Jerusalem. 3 deportations, 3 waves of exile. The first carried away Daniel and his companions. The second carried away the craftsmen, the soldiers, the leaders. The third, in 586 years before the Common Era, destroyed the city. The walls were breached, the temple was burned, the city was left in ruins, and the survivors were marched east, to Babylon. The exile had begun. Babylon, a city of staggering architectural ambition, massive walls, hanging gardens, a culture that dominated the ancient world as completely as any empire before or since. And into this city came the exiles of Judah. They sat by the rivers of Babylon, the Psalms record, and wept when they remembered Zion. But they did not simply weep. They survived. They maintained their identity. They prayed toward Jerusalem 3 times each day, as Daniel did. even when a royal decree made such prayer a capital offense. They refused to bow to golden statues. They stood in furnaces and walked out unburned. The exile lasted 70 years, precisely as Jeremiah had prophesied. And then, the Babylonian Empire fell to Persia. Cyrus the Great became the new master of the ancient world, and in the first year of his reign, he issued a decree. The Jewish people were free to return to their homeland, free to rebuild the temple, free to reconstruct what had been destroyed. This was not coincidence, according to the biblical record. The text explicitly states that Cyrus was moved to issue this decree in fulfillment of a prophecy that had named him by name over 150 years before he was born. The return from exile began. The restoration was slow, difficult, marked by opposition and discouragement. Under Zerubbabel, the foundation of the Second Temple was laid. The old men who had seen Solomon's temple wept. The young men who had never seen it shouted for joy. And the sound of weeping and the sound of celebration mixed together until they could not be distinguished from one another. Nehemiah returned and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days against constant opposition and threat, a feat that stunned even his enemies. Ezra returned and read the law to the people in the city square. They wept as they heard it. They had forgotten, and in that remembering, something was renewed. And then, silence, not literal silence, but a prophetic silence. The voice of the biblical prophets fell quiet. 400 years passed between the last words of Malachi and the beginning of what Christians call the New Testament era. 400 years of waiting. The Greeks came and went. Alexander the Great swept through the known world in a decade and died at 32, leaving his empire to be divided among his generals. The Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple in 167 years before the Common Era, triggering the Maccabean revolt and the miracle of Hanukkah. Then Rome came, and the world waited in the grip of Roman power for a promise made to Abraham, to David, to Isaiah, to Micah, to Zechariah, a promise that a child would be born. He was born in Bethlehem, not in a palace, not announced to kings or senators, but announced, the text says, to shepherds in a field outside the city, announced by a sudden burst of light and sound that the shepherds described as an army of angels filling the night sky. His mother was a young woman named Miriam, known to history as Mary. His earthly father, a carpenter named Joseph, of the house and lineage of David. His name, Yeshua. In Greek, Isus. In Latin, Jesus. In English, Jesus. For 30 years he lived in relative obscurity. Nazareth, the carpenter's workshop, the rhythms of Galilean life. Then, at 30, he came to the Jordan River. He was baptized by his cousin John, and the heavens, the text records, opened. A voice spoke, a dove descended, and the ministry began. 3 years. Only 3 years of public teaching, healing, confrontation, and demonstration. And yet those 3 years would divide history itself. They would become the hinge on which the entire arc of the biblical timeline would turn. He healed the blind. He raised the dead. He walked on water. He calmed storms with a word. He fed thousands from a handful of loaves and fish. He spoke to crowds of thousands and to individuals in the dark of night. He embraced the outcast and confronted the powerful. He made claims that no other figure in the ancient world had made. Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. I am the resurrection and the life. In Jerusalem, during the feast of Passover, the confrontation came to its climax. The religious establishment, threatened by his growing influence, conspired with Roman authority. Judas, one of his 12 closest disciples, agreed to lead them to him for 30 pieces of silver. In a garden called Gethsemane, on the night of the Passover meal, he was arrested. He was tried, mocked, flogged, crowned with thorns, and crucified. Outside the walls of Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, the one who had been announced by the prophets, foreshadowed in the Passover lamb, promised to Abraham as the seed through whom all nations would be blessed, was executed. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. According to the biblical accounts, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene in the garden, then to 2 travelers on the road to Emmaus, then to his disciples gathered in a locked room, then to more than 500 people at one time, according to Paul's account written within decades of the events. He walked, he spoke, he ate, he showed the marks of the nails. 40 days after the resurrection, he ascended, and his final words before ascending were not simply a farewell, they were a commission. Go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, and I am with you always, to the very end of the age. The end of the age. The timeline was still moving forward. 10 days after the ascension, on the Feast of Pentecost, something happened in Jerusalem that would change the world. A sound like a rushing wind filled the room where the disciples were gathered. What appeared to be tongues of fire rested on each of them, and they began to speak in languages they had never learned. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, people from every corner of the known world gathered in Jerusalem for the feast, heard the disciples speaking in their own native languages about the mighty works of God. Peter stood up and preached. 3,000 people were added to the community of believers that day, and the movement began to spread. Not by armies, not by political conquest, by witness, by testimony, by the willingness of ordinary men and women to carry the message of resurrection to every city and province of the Roman Empire. Saul of Tarsus, who had personally overseen the execution of believers, encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus and became Paul, the most prolific writer of the New Testament and the most effective missionary the early church produced. Within a generation, the message had reached Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, and beyond. Within 3 centuries, it had transformed the empire itself. But the timeline did not pause for triumph. In the year 70 of the Common Era, the Roman general Titus surrounded Jerusalem with 4 legions. The siege lasted months. Famine ravaged the city, and then the walls broke. The temple was destroyed. Fire consumed the sanctuary that had stood since the days of Zerubbabel, rebuilt and expanded by Herod into one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world. The stones were torn apart. The gold, melted by the heat of the flames, ran into the crevices of the foundation stones, and Roman soldiers pried every stone from its neighbor to recover it. Not one stone was left upon another, exactly as Jesus had said 40 years before, as he stood on the Mount of Olives looking across the valley at the gleaming temple courts, when his disciples pointed out the beauty of the buildings. "Do you see all these great buildings?" he had said. "Not one stone here will be left on another." The Jewish people were scattered again. A second great diaspora. This one lasting not 70 years, but nearly 2,000. And so began the long middle passage of the biblical timeline. Century after century, empire after empire, Rome, Byzantium, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Ottoman period, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Age, 2 world wars, the Jewish people without a homeland, scattered across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, the Americas. persecuted in ways too numerous and too horrifying to catalog, maintaining their identity, their language, their scripture, their faith against every force of history that sought to erase them, and the followers of Jesus spreading across the globe, translating the ancient texts into language after language, building communities of worship in every culture and every continent. All of it part of the pattern. All of it moving the timeline toward something. In 1948, something happened that many scholars consider one of the most significant prophetic markers in modern history. The State of Israel was declared. A nation that had not existed as a political entity for nearly 2,000 years suddenly existed again, in the very land promised to Abraham, in the very city that David had captured 3,000 years before, against all historical precedent. After the near annihilation of the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish lives were consumed in the darkness of the 20th century's most systematic campaign of genocide, the nation rose, not as a faint echo of what it had been, but as a living, functioning, modern state, with its ancient language restored. Hebrew, a language that scholars had considered essentially dead for centuries, became the spoken language of daily life. The fig tree, many scholars note, had begun to put out its leaves, and now we stand here. Not at the end, not quite, but somewhere in the final chapters of a story that began in a garden and has been building, line by line, era by era, toward its conclusion. The biblical prophetic literature describes a sequence of events that will mark the closing of this age. A time of global upheaval, described in the ancient texts with images so vivid and so specific that scholars have debated their meaning for 2,000 years. A period of unprecedented pressure on the earth and on the nations. A convergence of forces, political, spiritual, natural, that the book of Revelation describes with the full weight of apocalyptic imagery. And at the center of that convergence, Jerusalem, always Jerusalem, the city where Abraham offered Isaac, the city where David reigned, the city where Solomon built the temple, the city where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, the city that was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, the city that is, today, at the center of more geopolitical tension than any other place on earth. The prophets described a gathering of nations against that city, a final confrontation, a valley north of Jerusalem in the region of Galilee, a broad valley that has been the site of more battles than perhaps any comparable stretch of land on the planet. Megiddo, the hill above that valley, Har Megiddo. In Greek, Armageddon. What exactly Armageddon represents has been the subject of deep and serious theological reflection across many centuries. Some scholars understand it as a literal, final military engagement. Others interpret it as a symbolic representation of the ultimate collision between human rebellion and divine sovereignty. Many hold carefully to both dimensions simultaneously, understanding that the biblical prophets rarely chose between the literal and the symbolic, when both could carry the full weight of truth. What the texts agree on is this: the age does not end in chaos, it ends in resolution. In the book of Revelation, after the final battle, there is a vision of renewal, not simply the patching of a broken world, but the creation of something new. A new heaven and a new earth. A city descending from above, luminous and vast, whose dimensions and descriptions read less like architecture and more like poetry. A city where, the ancient text says, there will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, for the former things will have passed away. And so the full arc of the biblical timeline completes itself, not with destruction, but with restoration. What was lost in the garden is returned. What was broken at the fall is healed. What death claimed is reversed. The tree of life, which stood at the center of Eden and was barred after the expulsion, stands again at the center of the new city. Its leaves for the healing of the nations. The river that flowed from Eden flows again. The presence that filled the temple fills everything, and the name that was spoken over Abraham, that was carried through Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and all the prophets, the name that Jesus bore in human flesh fills the entire scope of the new creation like a light that casts no shadow. This is the shape of the biblical timeline, not a line moving randomly through history, not a circle endlessly repeating with no progress, but a spiral, ascending, moving through pattern and repetition and echo, but always climbing, always moving toward the moment when everything that was promised becomes everything that is. History moves forward, patterns repeat. The structure of the timeline is not accidental. It is not the product of random human storytelling accumulating over millennia. It bears the marks of intentional authorship, an architecture of meaning that stretches across 6,000 years of human experience and holds together with a coherence that demands to be taken seriously. From the first breath of Adam in the garden to the last, trumpet sounding over the valley of Megiddo, the story is not random. It is moving toward something.